Maplewood was not a grand house by the standards of England's oldest families, but to those who visited it for the first time, it always seemed impressive. The grey stone facade, softened by ivy and the climbing roses that hung about the tall mullioned windows, gave it an air of age and respectability. It stood at the edge of a small village in Surrey, surrounded by lawns that sloped gently into orchards and woodland beyond. The air about it was quiet, respectable, almost too well behaved, as though the house itself had a character of watchful discretion. It was a late September evening when the guests assembled. The weather had turned crisp after weeks of summer warmth, and the first hint of autumn lay in the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys. Inside, the drawing room glowed with the warmth of firelight, and lamps had been lit early against the gathering dusk. Lady Margaret Ashworth, mistress of Maplewood, was a woman of about 60, still erect of carriage and commanding in manner. Her hair, iron grey and immaculately dressed, lent her a formidable air. Yet her smile, though rare, was capable of softening her entire face. She had gathered this circle of guests, as she did each autumn, ostensibly to hear her niece perform. The niece, Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, was a pianist of some promise, though few in the family would have described her as genial. Reserved, serious, and inclined to melancholy, she had always been something of an enigma. By 6:30, the company was assembled. Sir Rowland Peveril, a bluff ex-military man in his 70s, sat heavily in one of the deep leather armchairs, a whiskey in hand. He had been a friend of Lady Margaret's late husband, and though his manners were loud, there was loyalty beneath his boisterous exterior. Opposite him perched Mrs. Clara Redfern, a widow with sharp eyes and sharper opinions. She was known in the district for her chatter, which left few reputations untarnished. Near her stood her son, Arthur, a pale young man of 25 who had the air of wishing himself elsewhere. Also present was Dr. James Armitage, Maplewood's physician, a tall, quiet man with spectacles that gave him an owlish look. He was courteous, though he seldom wasted words. His sister, Miss Beatrice Armitage, fluttered beside him, a spinster of 40 who fancied herself artistic, her thin fingers always twitching as though reaching for a sketchbook. Two more guests rounded out the party. Gerald Whitcomb, Eleanor's elder brother, was a businessman of bluff manner and thinning hair. He had recently returned from ventures abroad and carried with him the energy of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. With him was his wife, Marian, a striking woman in her 30s, whose easy laugh seemed to ripple through the drawing room like a bright note. At the piano, in a quiet corner, sat Eleanor herself. She had been coaxed into playing a few phrases, her pale face bent over the keys. The room grew still as the first notes filled the air, a haunting melody, delicate yet filled with something unspoken. Even Mrs. Redfern paused in her gossip to listen. When Eleanor's hands left the keyboard at last, there was a moment's silence before polite applause followed. Eleanor rose quickly, as though embarrassed, and murmured some excuse about the dim light. Her brother Gerald gave a loud word of praise, though one could not help but notice a glance exchanged between husband and wife, a glance that spoke of irritation rather than admiration. It was during this interlude that Lady Margaret rose to her feet. "My dear friends," she said, her voice carrying easily, "I thank you for indulging Eleanor. Music has ever been Maplewood's solace. But tonight I have more in mind than piano recitals. It is a family tradition to gather before the long winter sets in, to renew our ties and strengthen our bonds. And though the times grow uncertain, Maplewood shall endure." She raised her glass in a small, resolute toast. The company followed suit, though Arthur Redfern's gesture was half-hearted, and Eleanor herself seemed to shrink back as though longing to disappear. Later, as they moved to dinner, the atmosphere shifted. The long oak dining table gleamed with silver and crystal. The meal was a substantial one, befitting the season: roast pheasant, potatoes crisped and dripping, and a pear tart to follow. Yet for all the abundance, undercurrents moved among the guests like shadows beneath the surface of a still pond. Sir Rowland boomed about his days in India, but his reminiscences were punctuated by Gerald's brusque interruptions. Marian laughed prettily at Gerald's remarks, yet more than once her eyes drifted toward young Arthur Redfern, who blushed and dropped his gaze whenever they met hers. Mrs. Redfern, sharp-tongued as ever, made several comments about Lady Margaret's household accounts, noting with a sniff that keeping such a large staff in these days of austerity was a little extravagant. Gerald Whitcomb responded with a dry remark about widows who lived off their late husbands' pensions. The exchange drew a frosty silence until Lady Margaret diverted the conversation with questions about the harvest. Eleanor spoke scarcely a word throughout. Once, when pressed by Miss Armitage to discuss her repertoire, she murmured that she no longer intended to play in London. Her voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable bitterness. Gerald's head snapped up at that, his expression tightening. After dinner, they returned once more to the drawing-room, where coffee was served. A storm had risen outside, rain lashed the windows, and the wind whistled in the chimney. The lamps flickered, and for a moment Maplewood felt less a house of comfort than a fortress against the elements. It was then that Lady Margaret suggested Eleanor play once more, just one piece, for old time's sake. Reluctantly, Eleanor returned to the piano. She played not a lively tune but a somber adagio, the notes slow and mournful, as though drawn from some deep well of sorrow. The melody hung in the air long after her fingers stilled. The company applauded once more, but this time with unease. Even Sir Rowland's booming voice faltered. Clara Redfern cleared her throat loudly and spoke of the inconvenience of railway timetables, but the spell had been cast. Eleanor rose, pale and trembling, and with a curt excuse retired early to her room. The others lingered for an hour longer, speaking in lowered tones. At last Lady Margaret declared the evening concluded. One by one, the guests retired to their chambers. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the casements, as though warning of what was to come. Unnoticed in the bustle of servants clearing away coffee cups, a single sheet of music remained on the piano stand. Upon it was scrawled a melody that none of the guests recognized, its notes descending into a strange and unsettling cadence. The fire in the drawing-room burned low. The lamps were extinguished. Maplewood sank into darkness and silence, save for the wind's lament. And thus ended the first night, a night that would soon be remembered as the beginning of tragedy and of mystery. The storm which had clawed at Maplewood's eaves in the evening rose to a fury after midnight. By then the great house lay in ordered darkness. A single lamp burned in the long corridor of the east wing, and the red eye of the library's coal fire glowed dully behind its grate. Beyond that, only the wind had dominion, prowling round the corners, snatching at the ivy, moaning in the chimneys with a voice at once lonely and malignant. Households accustom themselves to certain sounds as to the habits of old servants: floorboards that creak in the passage outside the blue room, a sash that grumbles when the wind is easterly, the grandfather clock that insists upon striking the half-hour although the mechanism has been corrected 100 times. Maplewood's rhythms were well known. Precisely at 10 each evening the butler, Hargreaves, extinguished the lamps in the drawing-room, checked the fastening of the terrace doors, and, though he would have stoutly denied it, lingered a moment by the piano to straighten the scattered music with the fastidious piety of a man for whom symmetry is a creed. At 5 minutes to 10 on the night in question, he performed these duties. The rain drove against the stone terrace in horizontal sheets. Hargreaves frowned at the blackness beyond the tall windows, tested the catches, and, satisfied, turned away. He did not notice, because the angle of the shade put it into shadow, that a slim, nickel-plated tuning fork lay upon the polished ebony of the piano lid, as bright and innocent as a child's whistle. Most of the guests retired soon after. Sir Rowland, who drank his whiskey as though it were a moral responsibility, carried his square frame to the library for one last cigar. Dr. Armitage followed him, drawn, perhaps, by the opportunity to impress upon the old soldier the virtues of moderation in elevated tones. Mrs. Redfern and her son went up early, the former pronouncing the stair carpet uneven and a menace to respectable ankles. Gerald Whitcomb and his wife did not appear again downstairs, but their raised voices carried faintly along the corridor for several minutes, a detail noticed by Rose, the second housemaid, who, bearing hot water to Miss Armitage's room, paused with proper reluctance upon the landing and blushed at the thought of quarrels between married persons. Lady Margaret remained, for a time, in her late husband's study, going through papers. She had that admirable English quality of finding consolation in business. When the hall clock gave a soft, officious chime for 11:15, an odd thing occurred. Odd precisely because it was at variance with Maplewood's habitual order. From the drawing-room there came a note, then another, the faintest brush of sound, like a bird testing its throat before dawn. A chord followed, quiet, probing. Then, unmistakably, a phrase. The somber adagio Eleanor had played to the gathered company. The melody seemed to issue not from the polished instrument but from the house itself. It hung about the cornices and crept along the corridor. 2 bars, no more. It broke off abruptly, as though a hand had been snatched from the keys. Miss Beatrice Armitage heard it. She had a way of sitting up in bed sketching ladies in historical costume, necks overlong, hands like petals, and the smallest deviation from routine set her nerves a-tremble. She put down her pencil and listened. The rain drummed upon the window pane, the casement rattled. "How very foolish," she said aloud, for Miss Armitage had contracted the habit of speaking to herself as to a docile child, and reached to turn up the collar of her dressing gown. But before she did so, she heard a second sound, delicate and precise, the tick-tick-tick of a metronome. It was so trivial, so domestic a sound in that great sleeping house, that her apprehension evaporated. Eleanor had gone back to practice. Artists were like that, fey creatures of impulse. Miss Armitage smiled, imagined her own profile in the looking-glass. It bore, she maintained, a resemblance to Elizabethan beauties, and retired against the pillows. 5 minutes later she was asleep, and if the metronome continued to mark its inhumanly calm time in the empty room below, it did so without an audience. At 11:30 Sir Rowland and Dr. Armitage parted in the library, the former to his chamber with the unsteady solemnity of a man who knows each stair by lineage, the latter to make a brief, apologetic call upon Lady Margaret to deliver a prescription for her neuralgia. At 11:45, the wind abated for the space of a breath and the rain slackened. In that interstice of quiet there came, from the farther end of the east wing, a soft thud, as if a window, ill-secured, had been pushed open by a mischievous draught and shut again by the weight of water. Rose, the housemaid, paused upon her way to the attic stairs. She could not be sure. A thud is a commonplace event in old houses. It carries no message unless a mind chooses to write one upon its blank face. At midnight the telephones, there were 2 in the house, one upon the hall table and a smaller instrument in Lady Margaret's study, gave a series of petulant clicks and then fell dumb. The storm had downed a line in the lane between Maplewood and the village. At 12:05 the grandfather clock struck its melancholy 12 and, in defiance of Hargreaves' tinkering, the half-hour as well. At 20 past, the kitchen range coughed ash into its grate like a consumptive. At 1/2 all was quiet. The morning broke with scoured skies and a weak sun that had not the courage to warm the lawns. Maplewood's chimneys sent up thin banners of blue smoke. The house awoke to its domestic industry. Coal scuttles, the clink of china, footsteps softened by carpet in the main corridor and magnified into cannon fire in the servants' passage. It was the cook, Mrs. Finch, who first noticed that Miss Whitcomb had not yet rung for her chocolate. She made a remark about artistic ladies keeping artistic hours and returned to the business of eggs. By 9 o'clock, when the gong summoned the house to breakfast, Eleanor had not appeared. The company gathered with the brittle civility of persons who have not slept well. Sir Rowland complained of a draught that would, he was certain, end by doing for him. Mrs. Redfern found censure for the bacon underdone, the coffee overbrewed, and the day a Monday, which she considered fundamentally disagreeable. Arthur, pale and awkward, spilled marmalade and apologized to the cloth. Gerald Whitcomb maintained a hearty tone inconsistent with a little tremor of his left eyelid. Marian's laughter had lost a degree of its easy music. Lady Margaret alone preserved her equanimity, but the hand that lifted the silver coffee-pot was not quite steady. "Eleanor is late," she observed. "She was fatigued last night. Beatrice, my dear, would you ask Rose to take up a tray?" 10 minutes later Rose returned, knocking upon the breakfast-room door with an agitation that required no dramatizing. "Beg pardon, my lady. Miss Whitcomb, she isn't in her room." "Not in her room?" Lady Margaret set down the coffee-pot very carefully. "Has she gone out?" "The bed's not been slept in, my lady. Her evening gown is laid out over the chair just as I left it, and her shoes under the fender. The window is shut, but," Rose faltered, "there's a paper on the dressing-table, my lady, with lines of music." "I touched nothing." "Send Hargreaves to me," said Lady Margaret. Her voice was even. Only the whiteness about her mouth betrayed her disquiet. Hargreaves came in a moment later, upright as a halberd. "My lady, we shall look at Miss Whitcomb's room," she said. "Dr. Armitage, perhaps you will accompany us. Gerald, I think you also." They went in a small procession up the main stair, Lady Margaret in front, Hargreaves a pace behind with the solemn air of the guardian of a chapel, Dr. Armitage adjusting his spectacles as though the truth might be discovered upon the landing, Gerald with lips set and jaw thrust forward. Curiosity drew others after them. Mrs. Redfern in a cloud of righteous suspicion, Miss Armitage fluttering, Marian with a hand lightly at her throat, Arthur hovering at the edges as though his presence were a trespass. Eleanor's room lay at the far end of the east wing, a pleasing chamber with a view over the orchard. It was in such order as might have won Hargreaves' approval. The bed was smooth and hard, the coverlet uncreased, the nightdress folded precisely upon the pillow. On the dressing table lay a sheet of manuscript paper, ruled with a treble staff and bearing notes in a fine, precise hand. 4 bars, a rest, then a curious figure, an ascending third that fell back not to its tonic but to a sharpened interval. Dr. Armitage, peering, murmured, "Odd," in the tone of a man unexpectedly addressed in Greek. "Her evening gown?" asked Lady Margaret. Rose pointed. The gown, black georgette with a plain satin sash, lay across the chair back. A shawl of grey wool lay beside it. Beneath the fender, precisely where Rose had said, stood Eleanor's shoes, evening slippers in dull black kid. Upon the windowsill there was a small oval of damp, the size of a thumbprint, where condensation had gathered and dripped. Gerald went to the wardrobe, flung it open with a violence that made Miss Armitage start. "Her walking suit is gone," he said. "The brown tweed. And the stout shoes. The mackintosh as well." He turned. "She's gone out. Early. In a storm." "Why?" "Because she intended to meet someone," said Mrs. Redfern, who welcomed the prospect of scandal as parched land welcomes rain. "Or to run away. These musical girls. All nerves. There was something very peculiar about the noise last night. I heard it. Oh yes. The piano, at some unearthly hour." "The piano?" Lady Margaret's gaze shifted. "You heard it also, Beatrice?" "I think so," stammered Miss Armitage. "Only a little. And then a ticking. Forgive me, Lady Margaret, but I was half asleep." "We shall look in the drawing-room," said Lady Margaret. They went, the party larger now and less composed. The drawing-room preserved its morning chill. Hargreaves drew back the curtains and the pale light of the day fell upon emptiness. The piano, shut, reflected the long windows like a dark pool. On the lid lay the nickel-plated tuning fork. Dr. Armitage picked it up. "Still warm," he said, with a small frown, then corrected himself, embarrassed. "No, of course not. A foolish impression." Hargreaves moved to the mantel-shelf. "The metronome, my lady." It stood there, a neat pyramid of mahogany, its brass pendulum at rest midway in its arc, the weight set to mm72, adagio. Hargreaves extended a gloved forefinger and nudged it. The pendulum swung twice and died. "Someone practiced here late," said Gerald. "Eleanor." He spoke belligerently, as though the suggestion invited contradiction. Lady Margaret's gaze traveled about the room with the slow thoroughness of a mind that does not yield to panic. "What time was the room last secured, Hargreaves?" 5 to 10, my lady. "And the terrace doors?" "Fastened." Gerald strode to them and tried the handle. "Locked now." "The key?" "In its usual place, sir." Hargreaves indicated a small brass hook within the cupboard where the music was kept. It was empty. Marian, who had said nothing, crossed to the window and stared out. The stone flags of the terrace gleamed, washed clean by the night's violence. Beyond them the lawn fell away in gradients of green to the little belt of trees where a narrow, overgrown path led to the disused summer-house. "There are footprints," she said quietly. "2 sets. From the door and back again. See, on the bottom step where the water hasn't quite stood. They are, oh, so faint." The company pressed to see. The marks were there, indisputably, blurred by the subsequent rain, but visible where the last film of water had saved their edges from obliteration, the broad print of a man's shoe and a smaller, narrower impression. They overlapped in one place with an intimacy that made Marian, inexplicably, shiver. "Who has the key?" asked Lady Margaret. Hargreaves' expression altered to one of shocked paternity. "It should be upon the hook, my lady. I will make inquiries at once." He hesitated. "Mr. Arthur Redfern was in the drawing-room yesterday afternoon. He asked me for a match, however, I do not say." "You will not say anything, Hargreaves," Lady Margaret returned with gentleness edged in steel. "Not yet." There was a silence. The room, So lately the scene of muted applause and an adagio that had laid a chill hand upon the heart seemed to listen with them. A smell of damp wool came from the shawl folded over the back of a chair, the shawl Eleanor had worn earlier. Dr. Armitage, who was a careful man, touched its fringe and rubbed finger against thumb. "Salt," he said, surprised. "Sea salt." Then he recovered himself. "No, I am mistaken. The mind jumps. Eleanor has not been to the sea," said Lady Margaret. "Not these past months." But a shadow line deepened between her brows. Marian's gaze had fallen to the carpet beside the piano stool. "What is this?" she asked, bending. "A thread." Hargreaves stooped with the dignity of a man handling a liturgical object and lifted it upon a fingernail. It was a short length of pale horsehair, the sort used in the bows of stringed instruments, or perhaps, as Dr. Armitage suggested after a moment's consideration, a broken filament from the inner mechanism of the piano. Hargreaves wrapped it, with elaborate care, in his handkerchief. "Enough," said Lady Margaret. "We will not pick at corners like magpies. Hargreaves, send Peter to the village for Sergeant Yarrow. If the telephone is out, he must go at once on foot. No one is to leave the house or the grounds until the police have been." "Very good, my lady." "And, Hargreaves, ask the staff to gather in the morning room. Our guests will be kind enough to remain in the breakfast room." She looked round upon their anxious faces, Sir Rowland obstinate and incredulous, Mrs. Redfern avid, Miss Armitage fluttering, Marian self-contained and a little pale, Gerald with an angry spot of color high upon the cheek, Arthur shrinking from notice. "We shall have order," she said. "We shall not have panic. Eleanor will be found." She said it with calm authority. Nevertheless, one could feel the house stiffen like an animal pricking its ears at a distant sound. The police in such districts are steady men who take their weather like their ale. Sergeant Yarrow was no exception. He arrived at 11 with mud to the tops of his boots and a notebook in his pocket, made his bow to Lady Margaret, and went about his business. He asked his questions without flourishes and set down the answers with a shoriness of adjectives that would have gratified the heart of any exacting schoolmaster. The outline of the night emerged, not as a single picture but as a mosaic to which each person contributed a tessera. Sir Rowland had remained in the library until 20 to 12, whereafter he had betaken himself to bed, like a Christian. Dr. Armitage corroborated the hour. He, after leaving Sir Rowland, had seen Lady Margaret in her study until midnight. We discussed a prescription. Mrs. Redfern had written 2 letters at her writing case, to my cousin in Cheltenham and to the grocer respecting an unconscionable substitution of margarine for butter, and had retired a little before 11. Miss Armitage had heard the piano at about 11:15, no, perhaps nearer 10 past, and the metronome. Gerald and Marian Whitcomb, questioned separately, admitted to a domestic discussion which had concluded before 1/2 past, the one supplying 25 past, the other 28. Arthur, poor lad, stammered that he had gone to bed early with a headache. He had not left his room, he said. He had not slept, he said. He had heard nothing, he said. It is almost always suspicious, in such cases, to have heard nothing. Of the servants, Hargreaves had made his rounds and was in bed by 10. Mrs. Ellery, the housekeeper, had been darning linens in her sitting room until 11. Rose had been up and down the back stairs until 1/2 past, distributing hot water. Peter, the under-footman, had gone out briefly after 10 to the yard and returned before the half-hour, a detail which Sergeant Yarrow underlined and promised himself to verify. Mrs. Finch had slept the sleep of the just. The chauffeur, Lewis, had spent the night in his cottage by the stables, a circumstance which the rain on his oilskin cap ably confirmed. They searched. They looked in the rooms that had no business to contain a missing lady, the linen cupboard, the attic trunks, the small, shabby schoolroom with its faded chart of the counties of England. They went into the drawing-room again and again, as though the instrument might yield up the truth if sufficiently coaxed. The tuning fork lay now in the sergeant's pocket. The metronome, reproached for its indifference, was closed and removed to the top of the bookcase like a toy put out of an infant's reach. The terrace door had been locked. This Yarrow established beyond cavil by the marks upon the brass of key and escutcheon. And yet, those footprints. At 12:30, Rose, whose eyes were red, returned to Eleanor's room for the second time, compelled by some maidservant's instinct to set straight what fear had disarranged. She opened the wardrobe to assure herself that the brown tweed really was gone and, bending stiffly, for nerves go to the back, She noticed something beneath the hem of a plain walking dress. "Oh," she said, quite soft. She knelt, reached in, and drew out a pair of gloves, damp and stained, not with mud, nor with ink, but with something grayish-white, fine as ash, that formed a smear upon the kid. She looked at the hearth. The grate there was clean, as Hargreaves kept it, but upon the andiron lay a single soft feathering of the same pallid dust. In the drawing-room, at that same moment, Sergeant Yarrow ran a blunt finger along the edge of the piano keys and made a sound in his throat. On the A above middle C there was a faint discoloration, no more than a crescent where a fingertip had rested, darkened by the oils of skin and the faint soot that pervaded houses with real fires. 2 keys further, the C-sharp bore a matching shadow. He laid his palm upon the polished wood. His eye fell upon the music cupboard. "What pieces are these, then?" he inquired, not expecting and not receiving an answer, and replaced them tidily with a care that would have pleased Hargreaves. At 1 o'clock, Yarrow, who had a slow imagination compelled by facts, turned to Lady Margaret in the breakfast-room. "My lady," he said, "we have looked. She is not in the house." Lady Margaret did not start. She had the fortitude bred by long acquaintance with both duty and grief. "Then she is on the grounds. The path to the summer-house. Have you tried there?" "We have, my lady. The steps are perilous with wet. There are marks, a going and a coming, but the rain has spoiled them. The key to the terrace door is missing," said Lady Margaret. "Yes." Gerald's chair scraped. "Enough of this fumbling, Yarrow. Signalers on the telephone will be as slow as molasses. Send a man to the next exchange. Wire to London. We'll have a detective down today." Yarrow, whose pride was local and stubborn, bristled. "There is no need to." "There is every need," said Lady Margaret, and her voice made both men turn to her. "Sergeant, you have been thorough. But this is not an ordinary disappearance. There are things here which—" She paused, and for the first time her composure wavered. "Eleanor is not a fanciful woman. She would not run away in a storm to indulge an impulse. I must have someone who sees beneath the surfaces of things." "Begging your pardon, my lady," said Hargreaves from the doorway, "but a gentleman is here who might, perhaps, be of assistance. He is a guest at the Crown and Heart in the village, prevented from his onward journey by the line being down. He sent in his card on the chance that, well—" Hargreaves' face, habitually impassive, permitted itself the faintest quiver of satisfaction at the aptness of destiny. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." There was, then, a pause in which the breath of the house seemed to draw itself in. Mrs. Redfern's mouth fell open. Sir Rowland said, "By gad!" Miss Armitage clapped her hands once, and then recoiled at her own impropriety. Marian's head turned swiftly towards Gerald, whose eyelid jerked again. Arthur, who had never heard the name, felt without knowing why that a cord had been plucked within him, a fear not of exposure but of understanding. "Show Monsieur Poirot in, Hargreaves," said Lady Margaret. And thus, while the weak autumn sun sat indecisive over the drenched lawns and the adagio of Eleanor's composition still seemed, for those who had ears to hear, to tremble in the cornices, the little Belgian, immaculate hat, patent leather shoes unspotted by the mud he had declined to walk in, came into the breakfast-room of Maplewood and made his small bow. It was at that precise moment that Peter, the under-footman, pale with haste, appeared in the doorway behind him. His voice broke upon the words, "Sergeant, my lady, by the summer-house." They looked at him. He swallowed. "We have found her glove, and a handkerchief, caught in the briars, with blood." The sound that followed was not a cry but an indrawn breath from every chest. Poirot's eyes, very green and very calm, rested upon the trembling young man. Then he looked at Lady Margaret and inclined his head slightly, as a surgeon might at the bedside before lifting the sheet. "Come," he said. "We go, yes, and very delicately. For the music of this affair, I think, is written pianissimo." The house, which had been listening, listened harder. Outside, the wind found a voice again and began, with an almost human persistence, to whistle the first 2 bars of a melody no one yet knew how to hear. The figure who entered the breakfast-room of Maplewood that morning seemed at once out of keeping with its sober Englishness and yet peculiarly suited to it. Hercule Poirot, small, compact, dressed with fastidious neatness, stood framed in the doorway like a jewel in its case. His mustaches, waxed to their immaculate points, caught the faint light from the windows. His patent leather shoes gleamed though he had crossed the muddy drive, and his gray suit, pressed with geometric perfection, gave the impression not of travel but of ceremonial. He removed his hat with a small flourish, placed it precisely upon a chair near the door, and bowed. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said softly, "permit that I intrude. Your butler, he is the soul of discretion. He tells me only that une jeune demoiselle, your niece, Lady Margaret, has not returned to her bed. And there are," he lifted a gloved hand delicately, "circumstances." Lady Margaret, who had risen, came forward to greet him. Though her face was pale and her lips tight, she retained her composure. "Monsieur Poirot, your presence is most fortunate. You are correct. My niece, Eleanor Whitcomb, has vanished. The police are here already, but I felt that this is no ordinary matter." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Non. There is nothing ordinary in the disappearance of a young lady who leaves behind her gown, her shoes, her chamber so neatly arranged, who vanishes, it seems, into the night air with no cloak but her music. That, it is already curious. Permit me, Lady Margaret. I will assist." Sergeant Yarrow, a man unused to international reputations, shifted in his chair with a frown. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but this is a police matter." Poirot turned to him with a smile as courteous as it was unyielding. "Ah, mon sergeant, you are correct, absolument. But two heads, particularly when one is Belgian, NSCE pas, are better than one. I intrude not upon your duty. I add only a little, what do you say, éclaircissement, illumination. We are allies, yes." Lady Margaret's hand touched the back of the chair beside her. "Sergeant, I wish Monsieur Poirot to remain. There are matters here of delicacy." "I trust him." Yarrow, cornered by rank and reputation, grunted and rose. "As you please, my lady." Poirot surveyed the room. His eyes, bright and bead-like, traveled from one face to another with the gentleness of a caress and the firmness of a probe. He saw Sir Rowland's ruddy countenance, set stubbornly as though against artillery fire, Mrs. Redfern's eyes, sharp and eager, Arthur's pallid anxiety, Miss Armitage's flutter of excitement poorly concealed by a handkerchief, Gerald's belligerent jaw, Marian's composed but guarded poise. Each expression registered in his mind with the precision of a ledger entry. He spoke with quiet finality. "Bon. You will forgive me, Messrs. et Mesdames, if I ask the small questions. For it is by the small that we arrive at the great. Always. It is the dust on the shoe, the thread on the chair, the note that is struck too loudly, that gives to Hercule Poirot the key." They began with the scene at the summer-house. The household and several guests accompanied Poirot, though Lady Margaret insisted that Mrs. Redfern and her son remain behind. The widow protested, "It is my duty as a guest to assist." But Lady Margaret's raised eyebrow silenced her. The path leading to the summer-house was sodden, the grass pressed down by the weight of storm. The summer-house itself was little more than a timbered folly, its once white paint now gray with mildew, its roof sagging under ivy. The door stood half ajar, the latch broken long ago. Near the threshold, caught in the briars, fluttered a fragment of lace-edged handkerchief. It was stained at one corner with what all could see was blood. Nearby, half hidden in the wet grass, lay a single glove of grey kid, sodden and marked with the same faint pallid dust Rose had seen upon Eleanor's pair. Poirot bent delicately, his gloved hand never quite touching the objects. His eyes narrowed. "See, my friends. The glove, it is placed here, almost carefully. Not torn from the hand in struggle, but dropped. A little theatrical, peut-être." He straightened, his expression unreadable. "And the blood, it is not much. A prick, a scratch, perhaps. But sufficient to alarm." Sergeant Yarrow scowled. "You're saying this might be staged?" Poirot spread his hands. "I say only, one must not accept the appearance without testing it. The glove, the handkerchief, yes, they tell a story. But is it the true story? That we must discover." He stepped into the summer-house. The interior was damp and smelled of mildew. A broken chair leaned in a corner, cobwebs clung to the rafters. Yet upon the dusty floor lay faint marks, the impression of shoes, one small, one larger. Poirot crouched, studied them, then tapped his mustache. "Two persons. They stand close, here. One moves back, one forward. And then, regardez. He pointed to a scuff at the threshold. One shoe turns sharply. The body weight shifts. Is it in anger? In fear? Perhaps both. Gerald Whitcomb spoke gruffly. But Eleanor is not here. Whoever she met, she is gone. Poirot's eyes flickered toward him. Gone. But to where, and with whom, that is the melody we must complete. They returned to the house. Poirot requested to see Eleanor's room. Lady Margaret led him to the east wing, the others following like pupils drawn to a schoolmaster. Poirot paused at the threshold, his eyes moving not to the obvious, the untouched bed, the folded nightdress, but to the small details, the symmetry of the dressing table, the precise alignment of shoes under the fender, the single drop of condensation upon the sill. He picked up the sheet of manuscript paper. His eyes traveled the notes, his lips moving silently. Then he nodded once, sharply. Curieux. The melody, it begins with sadness, yes, but see here. He tapped a bar with his finger. It ascends, not to repose but to dissonance. A cry, not a resolution. To whom was she writing this? For whom was this music intended? Marian, standing in the doorway, spoke softly. She never showed her compositions. She guarded them fiercely. Poirot turned, his eyes piercing. But now she leaves one, unfinished, upon her table? Why, madam? Why not place it in her folio, hide it in her case? None. She wishes it to be found. That is certain. He replaced the paper with reverence. His eyes caught the faint smear upon the shawl draped over the chair. He bent, touched it lightly, then smelled his fingertip. Salt. Yes, unmistakable. But not the sea. Not here in Surrey. No, this is from tears. The silence that followed was heavy. Gerald shifted impatiently. You make poetry, monsieur. What does it prove? Poirot's eyes glinted. It proves that Mademoiselle Eleanor wept before she left this room. And that, monsieur, is not poetry but psychology. Poirot requested each guest's account of the night. He listened with his head inclined, hands folded upon his cane. To Sir Rowland's blustering recollections of cigars, he nodded. To Mrs. Redfern's tart insistence that she heard the piano, he murmured, exactment. To Miss Armitage's fluttering about the metronome, he smiled indulgently. Gerald's brusque assertions he met with silence, while Marian's measured tones earned him a long, penetrating gaze that made her look away. At last he asked Arthur Redfern, who had sat shrinking in his chair, pale and nervous. And you, mon jeune monsieur, you retired early, you say. You slept. Arthur stammered. I tried to. But the storm, I had a headache, I heard nothing. Poirot's mustache twitched. You heard nothing? That is curious. Others heard the piano, the metronome, even the wind's lament. But you, nothing. That, mon cher, is almost too much silence. Arthur flushed scarlet and looked at his plate. Poirot straightened. Messrs. et mesdames, I will say only this. Last night, a drama was played in this house. It has 3 acts. First, the music, the strange melody. Second, the disappearance. Third, that will come. But know this, one among you can already tell me the ending. One of you holds the final note. And Hercule Poirot, he tapped his temple, will hear it, even if it is played pianissimo. Lady Margaret's voice broke the silence. Monsieur Poirot, you believe Eleanor has come to harm? Poirot bowed his head gravely. I believe, madam, that the missing melody of Maplewood is not merely of music. It is of life. And we must listen most carefully indeed. The storm outside had passed, but within the house of Maplewood a greater tempest was rising, one of suspicion, secrets, and fear. The rain had washed Maplewood clean, but inside the house, the air was heavy with unease. Breakfast had been cleared away. The servants moved in hushed tones, their footsteps muffled as though by mutual agreement. In the drawing-room, Poirot had arranged chairs in a semicircle near the fire, though he himself sat slightly apart, back straight, hands folded across his polished cane. He had declared, with gentle authority, that he would speak to each person in turn. Understand, Miss Amos, he said, looking round the circle of uneasy faces. I do not accuse, I do not condemn. I merely listen. But to listen well is to see. And when one sees, then the truth is as clear as glass. Lady Margaret had given her permission, though her lips were compressed. Sergeant Yarrow remained nearby, notebook ready, but his eyes kept straying toward Poirot with a mixture of doubt and reluctant admiration. Poirot began, as he so often did, with the most forceful personality in the room. Sir Rowland Peveril. The old soldier shifted heavily in his chair, his shoulders square, his mustache bristling. You'll get nothing from me, Poirot. I was in the library till 20 to 12, smoking a cigar that nearly finished me. Then straight to bed. Ask Armitage. He'll vouch for it. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed. And the cigar, Sir Rowland, it was good. Ghastly. Damp, I suspect. I told James so. And during your smoke, did you hear nothing? No piano, no voice, no step in the corridor? Sir Rowland frowned. Piano? No. Thunder, wind, yes. Enough to drown an orchestra. Besides, my hearing isn't what it was. A shell at Ypres, you know. Poirot's eyes narrowed. So, you heard nothing unusual, and yet others did. Curious, NSCE pas? Still, I thank you. He made a small note in his pocketbook. Sir Rowland looked indignant. What's curious about it? People hear what they want to hear. Poirot smiled faintly. Just so. Mrs. Clara Redfern. The widow leaned forward eagerly, eyes sharp, hands clasped tightly. I heard the piano, Monsieur Poirot. Oh yes, quite distinctly. At a most unearthly hour. I thought at once of Miss Whitcomb, eccentric, of course, but hardly surprising. Artists are like that. And then I said to myself, what if she were meeting someone? A young man, perhaps. They are prone to romantic escapades, these girls. Poirot raised a hand delicately. Madam, you speculate. But the facts, s'il vous plaît. You heard the piano. What time? Near 11. Or perhaps later. I cannot be certain. The storm was dreadful. But it was the very same piece she played earlier, the sad one. I recognized it at once. Poirot nodded. And you told no one? Mrs. Redfern sniffed. What was there to tell? I am not the sort to meddle in another's affairs. Poirot's mustache twitched. Non. Forgive me, madam, but I think you meddle in everything. Still, you have given me a truth. You heard the melody. For that, I thank you. Mrs. Redfern, startled, drew back in her chair, lips pursed. Arthur Redfern. Arthur sat stiffly, hands gripping his knees, his pale face betraying both discomfort and fear. I was in my room, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't hear anything. Truly, I didn't. Poirot leaned forward. Nothing. The storm, yes. But the piano. The metronome. Arthur shook his head violently. No. I had a headache. I took aspirin. I tried to sleep. Poirot studied him a moment, then spoke gently. And yet others heard. That you heard nothing, it is almost too perfect. Tell me, young man, do you admire Madame Whitcomb? Pardon, Mrs. Gerald Whitcomb. Arthur flushed crimson. I don't know what you mean. Poirot's eyes softened. Ah, mon cher, I think you do. But we will leave that. For now. Arthur looked as though he might faint. Poirot said nothing more, only made a small note. Dr. James Armitage. The physician adjusted his spectacles, calm and precise. I can vouch for Sir Rowland's time. I left him at 20 to 12, then went to Lady Margaret's study, where I remained until midnight. She will confirm it. I heard no piano. Poirot tilted his head. But your sister, she did. Beatrice imagines things, said the doctor dryly. She has a vivid fancy. I trust my own ears. Poirot's eyes glittered. Doctor, you are precise, yes? You believe only in what is measured, weighed, observed. But psychology, it is not so simple. A sound, a shadow, it may tell more than a scalpel. Dr. Armitage made no reply, only pressed his lips together. Miss Beatrice Armitage. She fluttered into the chair, a sketchbook clutched to her bosom. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, it was dreadful. I heard the piano, yes, and then the tick-tick-tick of the metronome. I thought Eleanor must be working on something extraordinary. Such artistic temperament. But I was afraid, too. It was, she lowered her voice, ghostly. Poirot raised a finger. You say ghostly, but you are certain it was real? Her hands trembled. Yes, quite certain. I remember the notes distinctly. And the metronome, so cold, so precise. Poirot leaned closer. And tell me, mademoiselle, when you heard these sounds, was it before the clock struck the 1/4 or after? She hesitated. I do not know. It might have been a little before, or a little after. Poirot's eyes shone. To the minute, we cannot say. But the impression, it is true. Merci. Gerald Whitcomb. Gerald came forward with belligerent energy. His voice was loud, his manner defensive. I'll tell you plain, Poirot. Eleanor is unstable. She's always been unstable. She broods, she sulks, she fills the house with these melancholy airs. If she's gone of her own accord. I don't know why we waste time. Poirot steepled his fingers. And yet she left her room untouched, her evening dress laid out, her music unfinished. That does not suggest flight. It suggests interruption. Gerald's mouth twisted. You're the detective. You tell me. Poirot's gaze lingered on him. I will. In time. But first, monsieur, answer me. You and your wife, last night, you argued, did you not? Gerald's eyes flickered. Married people argue. It is nothing. Poirot's voice was very soft. Is it nothing? Or is it the shadow of something greater? We shall see. Marian Whitcomb. She entered her chair with grace, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Her face was pale but composed. Madam, Poirot said gently, you are not as your husband. You speak less, you conceal more. But I see in your eyes. Last night you knew something. Marian's lips parted, then closed. At last she said quietly, Eleanor is unhappy. She has been for months. My husband does not see it. But I did. She wrote her music not for herself, Monsieur Poirot, but for someone she would not name. Poirot's eyebrows rose. For someone? A lover, perhaps. Marian's eyes flickered toward Arthur, then away. I cannot say. Only, she was not alone in her thoughts. Of that I am sure. Poirot inclined his head, his eyes thoughtful. At last, when all had spoken, Poirot rose. He paced the room once, twice, his patent leather shoes clicking upon the parquet. Then he stopped, turned, and spoke with quiet certainty. Mess Amos, I tell you this, Eleanor Whitcomb did not vanish into the storm by chance. No, she vanished because one among you made it so. Last night there was music. Music that should not have been. There were lies, small, quiet lies that grow like weeds. I will listen to these lies. I will watch. And soon, very soon, we shall hear the true melody. He tapped his temple with a small, neat gesture. For the little gray cells, they already begin to play. Suspicion has a curious way of fastening itself, not upon the guilty, but upon the weakest link in a chain. By the afternoon of that anxious day, the household of Maplewood had already decided, each in their own way, that young Arthur Redfern bore the most likely guilt. He was timid, he blushed when addressed, he stammered under questioning. In the eyes of the others, these were signs not of innocence but of concealment. Even Sergeant Yarrow, cautious as he was, had narrowed his gaze upon the young man. You'll forgive me, Mr. Arthur, he said that afternoon, notebook in hand, but your account's thin. You say you retired early, yet you heard nothing. Not the piano, not the thunder, not the servants on the stairs. That don't sit right with me. Not right at all. Arthur flushed crimson. I had a headache. I told you, I took aspirin. Maybe so, Yarrow said. But aspirin doesn't make a man deaf, nor does it wash away footprints. The company had gathered again in the drawing-room, the piano looming silently against the far wall, its polished surface now closed and forbidding. Outside the rain had ceased, leaving the lawns damp and glittering beneath weak sunlight. But inside, the atmosphere pressed down, heavy with suspicion. Mrs. Redfern, her voice sharp as ever, spoke with relish. "It is no use coddling him, Sergeant. Arthur was always too close to that girl. A young man becomes infatuated, Eleanor rejects him, what then? He loses his temper, drags her out into the storm. Mother!" Arthur burst out, his voice breaking. "That isn't true. I never. Poirot, seated in a small chair apart, raised one hand. His voice was soft, but it carried authority. "Let us not leap. We must walk step by step. Always." Sir Rowland snorted. "Nonsense. The lad's guilty, anyone can see it. Those footprints at the terrace, his are the smaller ones, mark my words. He followed the girl, perhaps forced her. Young blood, rash temper, that's the way of it." Gerald Whitcomb, arms folded, added harshly, "If Eleanor was fool enough to encourage him, then she's paid the price. He ought to be held." Marian said nothing, but her eyes flickered once, swiftly, almost imperceptibly, toward Arthur. It was not condemnation but pity. Poirot noticed everything. Later, Poirot requested that Arthur walk with him upon the terrace. The others remained indoors, their faces pressed to the glass as though the scene were a play performed for their benefit. Arthur walked stiffly, his hands twisting. "Monsieur Poirot, I swear I had nothing to do with this. Eleanor, she was kind to me, that is all. I admired her, yes, but I never harmed her. I couldn't." Poirot's eyes rested on him gently. "Mon petit, I believe you. But belief is not enough. We must show it. Courage, yes. Tell me, what did you hear last night? Tell me not what you think I wish to hear, but the truth." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "The storm kept me awake. And, yes, I did hear something. Not the piano, no. But footsteps. On the corridor. Slow, deliberate. Then a door closing. I was afraid. I thought if I spoke, they'd laugh at me. So I said nothing." Poirot nodded once. "Bon. You see, already the truth, it begins to emerge. A man who lies, he does not confess to half-truths. You are not guilty, mon cher. But you are in danger, because suspicion, it clings." Arthur's face crumpled with relief, though the shadow of fear remained. Meanwhile, suspicion in the house thickened. Mrs. Redfern whispered loudly that her son had always been delicate, and such delicacy hides dangerous impulses. Sir Rowland shook his head with soldierly certainty. Gerald muttered of weaklings and hysterics. Even Lady Margaret, composed though she remained, cast glances of unease toward the young man. But Poirot remained calm. He observed. He noted that Gerald spoke with more eagerness when condemning Arthur than when defending his missing sister. He noted that Marian avoided her husband's gaze. He noted the curious silence of Dr. Armitage, who seemed to study the matter as though it were a medical specimen rather than a human tragedy. It was Marian who at last approached Poirot privately, in the small conservatory where the orchids sent up their faint perfume. Her voice was low, urgent. "Monsieur Poirot, you do not believe Arthur guilty, do you?" Poirot looked at her sharply. "And if I did, madam?" Her eyes filled with sudden heat. "Then you would be wrong. He is foolish, yes. Infatuated, perhaps. But he could never harm Eleanor. He is too gentle." Poirot inclined his head. "You defend him with warmth." "Why, madam?" She hesitated. "Because I see how everyone looks at him, how Gerald speaks of him. And because," she paused, lowering her voice, "because Gerald himself has more to fear from Eleanor's disappearance than Arthur ever could." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, now we begin to play a different tune." That evening, the household sat down to dinner, but the meal was a strained affair. Conversation limped, broken by silences that seemed to accuse. Arthur ate little, his mother scolding him under her breath. Gerald spoke loudly of business abroad. Sir Rowland muttered into his soup. Marian toyed with her food. Poirot alone appeared content, his napkin folded precisely, his mustaches immaculate. He spoke little, yet his eyes traveled from face to face, listening to words not spoken. When the meal concluded, and Lady Margaret had risen, Poirot stepped forward. His voice was light, yet it carried to every corner of the dining room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "I ask only this, do not deceive yourselves. It is comfortable, yes, to believe the guilt belongs to the weakest among you. But comfort is not truth. And Hercule Poirot, he seeks the truth always, even if it is unpleasant." His eyes moved slowly across the table, pausing upon Gerald, upon Marian, upon Dr. Armitage. Then, with a small bow, he withdrew. And in his mind, the melody of Maplewood grew clearer, a tune of sorrow, of lies, of pride, and of something darker still, waiting in the shadows. The morning of the second day at Maplewood dawned pale and cold. A mist clung to the lawns, turning the orchard trees into gray silhouettes. The house itself seemed hushed, listening, as though aware that its secrets were now being plucked one by the precise fingers of Hercule Poirot. Poirot began the day with a small ritual of his own. While the others lingered at breakfast, subdued and irritable, he excused himself and walked alone into the drawing-room. The piano stood silent, its black surface reflecting the pale light from the windows. He drew up a chair and sat, his small hands folded neatly, his head tilted as though he were not merely looking but listening. After several minutes of stillness, he rose. With the delicacy of a surgeon, he opened the lid of the piano. His eyes traveled over the keys, the hammers, the strings. Then, with the faintest smile, he plucked something from beneath the keys and held it up between finger and thumb. It was a broken thread, pale, fine, and slightly stiff, not unlike horsehair. Poirot rolled it gently. "Yes," he murmured, "the bow of a violin, or the hair of a piano hammer. No, not quite. Something else." At that moment, Sergeant Yarrow entered, his boots loud upon the parquet. "What's this then, monsieur? More dust and scraps. We'll not solve a disappearance with threads." Poirot turned, his expression one of mild reproach. "Ah, mon ami, but it is always the small thing which betrays the great. This thread, where does it come from? That is the question. You see, a clue is not only what it is, but what it is not." Yarrow grunted. "Well, it tells me nothing." Poirot only smiled. "But it tells Poirot a story, and one day soon I shall read it aloud." The manuscript paper. Poirot returned to Eleanor's room. The sheet of music lay still upon the dressing table, its unfinished melody taunting with its unresolved cadence. He bent over it again, his brow furrowed. Lady Margaret entered quietly behind him. "Monsieur Poirot, you study her composition?" Poirot turned, bowing. "Indeed, madam. Tell me, did your niece often leave her music so carelessly displayed?" "Never," Lady Margaret said with certainty. "She was jealous of it. She would snatch the sheets away if anyone approached too closely." "Precisement," Poirot murmured. "Then this sheet, left in plain sight, was meant to be seen. And the music itself, it speaks. Do you see these notes here? The leap, the unresolved dissonance, it is not complete. It cries out for resolution. That is psychology, Lady Margaret. It is the mind of Eleanor, written in ink." Lady Margaret's lips trembled. Then she knew something. She expected an ending. Poirot's eyes softened. "Yes, madam. She wrote her fear in music. A visit to the summer-house." Later that morning, Poirot insisted on returning once more to the summer-house, dragging the reluctant Sergeant Yarrow with him. The ground was still damp, the air cold. The glove and the fragment of handkerchief had been removed, but the briars remained, clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. Poirot crouched again at the threshold. "Regardez. Yesterday we saw the footprints, blurred, overlapped. But see here, at the edge of the step, a small fragment of wax." He pointed. Yarrow leaned down, squinting. "Candle wax. Could be anything. Servants leave rubbish about." Poirot lifted the fragment delicately with a handkerchief. "Non, mon ami. This is new. It is white, pure. A candle carried in the night. But why? The storm had not yet extinguished the lamps of the house. A candle, therefore, is deliberate. It conceals more than it reveals. Someone wished to pass unseen." Yarrow frowned. "So you think she met someone here, by arrangement?" Poirot's mustache twitched. It is possible. But see, the candle tells me another thing. The glove, the handkerchief, they are too convenient, yes? Too easy. But the candle wax, it is clumsy. It betrays. One plants a glove, perhaps, but one does not think of the wax one leaves behind. A conversation with Marian. That afternoon, Poirot sought Marian Whitcomb in the conservatory. She stood among the orchids, her face pale, her posture tense. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you care for young Arthur, do you not?" Her eyes widened. "Aye, he is innocent. You must see that." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, innocence. It is fragile. One must protect it. And yet, I think you fear more for yourself. You are unhappy, madam. I see it in your eyes." Her lips parted, then closed. Gerald is a difficult man. He does not understand gentleness. Eleanor did. Perhaps that is why. She stopped, shaking her head. "No, I cannot." Poirot's voice was soft, coaxing. "You may tell me, madam. Already I know much. Eleanor wrote her music not for herself, but for another. Was it for you, or for one you love?" Her hands trembled as they touched the leaves of a plant. "I cannot say." Poirot bowed. "As you wish. But remember, madam, silence is also a note in the melody. And I hear it." Poirot's reflection. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the library, a small fire burning. He took out his notebook and wrote 3 words upon a page. Music, wax, tears. He tapped the page with his pen. These are not trifles. They are the notes of the symphony. And when the symphony ends, then we shall know who conducted it. His eyes narrowed. The glove, the handkerchief, they are false. Too obvious. But the wax, it is true. The tears, they are true. Eleanor, pauvre enfant, she played her own requiem, and she knew it. From the hall beyond came the sound of footsteps, light and cautious. Poirot closed his notebook swiftly, his eyes sharpening. "Ah," he murmured, "the house itself whispers. Someone cannot sleep." He rose, adjusted his mustaches, and prepared to listen again. For the melody of Maplewood was still playing, faint but insistent, and only Hercule Poirot had the ear to catch its every note. By the 3rd morning, Maplewood had become a house divided against itself. Where once there had been the faint comfort of shared bewilderment, there now crept suspicion, sharpened whispers, and the unease of those who fear their own secrets may be brought to light. Poirot, moving delicately through the rooms like a small cat in polished shoes, seemed to sharpen that unease merely by existing. He asked his quiet questions, tilted his head, tapped his mustaches. The household grew restless. "It is intolerable," Sir Rowland grumbled after luncheon. "We are prisoners in this house while that little fellow plays his games. If the girl is not found soon, I'll go back to London and be damned to the lot of you." Yet even Sir Rowland's bluster was tinged with something new, fear. It was Gerald Whitcomb who drew Poirot's first decisive scrutiny that day. Poirot found him in the study, poring over a stack of papers that had been left on Lady Margaret's desk. Gerald started guiltily as Poirot entered. "Private family matters," Gerald muttered, sweeping the papers together. Poirot bowed slightly. "But of course. Only, permit me, monsieur, one small curiosity. You are a businessman, oui? Ventures abroad." Gerald stiffened. "What of it?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And yet, your hands, they are restless. You play with the papers not to read them, but to conceal. One might almost imagine there is something in these papers that displeases you." Gerald's face darkened. "You go too far, Poirot. This is none of your concern." Poirot's voice was calm. "Everything is of my concern, monsieur, when it touches upon the disappearance of your sister. Tell me, did she threaten you? Did she know something?" Gerald's mouth twisted. Eleanor was a dreamer. She had no place in business. She knew nothing of accounts. Poirot's mustaches twitched. But music, it is also numbers, order, sequence, balance. Perhaps she saw what you did not wish her to see. It is possible, yes." Gerald gave no reply, only swept the papers more roughly into the drawer. Poirot observed, noted, and left. Poirot found Marian later, standing at a window that overlooked the mist-damp orchard. She looked pale, her dark eyes shadowed. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you are unhappy. That one sees at once." She turned, startled. "Why do you say that?" "Because your laughter, it is too perfect. Always at the right moment, always a little too loud. It is the laughter of one who hides. Tell me, madam, what do you hide?" Her hands clenched together. I cannot." "None," Poirot said softly. "You mean you dare not. There is a difference." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot bowed, as though satisfied. Yet his eyes lingered on her pale face, and in his notebook later he wrote a single phrase: "Marian knows more." That afternoon, Poirot invited Mrs. Redfern to tea in the morning room. She came eagerly, her eyes alight with gossip. "I always said there was trouble in this house," she began, even before the cups were poured. "A girl like Eleanor, secretive, morose. She was bound to come to grief. And Gerald, well, he's no saint. Money troubles, I've heard. And his wife, H.M. Too pretty by half. It would not surprise me if Eleanor knew something she oughtn't. Blackmail, perhaps." Poirot's brows rose. "Blackmail, madam? You suggest that Eleanor was capable of such a thing?" Mrs. Redfern leaned forward. "Not capable, perhaps, but driven. She was bitter, I tell you. And bitterness makes people dangerous." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet, madam, it is curious. You speak much of others, but nothing of your own son. He is pale, nervous, afraid." "Why?" Mrs. Redfern sniffed. "Arthur is sensitive. He was fond of Eleanor, yes, but no more than that. He would never harm her. Never." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet you feared it. That is why you are so eager to cast suspicion elsewhere." Mrs. Redfern's face tightened. "You insult me." Poirot bowed. "Jamais, madam. I merely observe. But the truth, it creeps out, whether one wills it or not." That evening, Poirot sought Dr. Armitage in the library. The doctor sat reading, spectacles low on his nose. "Doctor," Poirot began, "tell me, when last you saw Eleanor, what impression had you of her state of mind?" Armitage closed his book with deliberate care. "She was fragile, prone to melancholy. I prescribed rest, quiet, and mild sedatives." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah, sedatives. And did she take them?" "I believe so." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Poirot said quietly, "I see in her eyes, in her music, not only melancholy but fear." "Did she confide in you?" Dr. Armitage's face hardened. "She said very little. Patients often do. I am a doctor, not a confessor." Poirot bowed slightly. "Mais oui. And yet, even doctors may conceal." "Tell me, doctor, what do you conceal?" Armitage's lips pressed tight. "You presume too much, Monsieur Poirot." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "But presumption, it is the cousin of truth." That night, Poirot sat alone once more, his small fire burning low. He reviewed his notes, neat and orderly. Gerald hides papers. Marian hides tears. Mrs. Redfern hides fear of her son. The doctor hides silence. He tapped the page gently. Lies, lies, everywhere. But lies, mes Amos, are like the wrong notes in a melody. They cannot be concealed. To the trained ear, they betray themselves. His eyes narrowed. "Soon, I shall catch one of you in the wrong note. And then, the melody will begin to resolve." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the panes. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Poirot did not move, but his mustaches twitched. "Ah," he murmured, "the house itself sings. We must listen." The rain had returned with a steady, dreary patter, the sort that blurred the edges of the world into a gray monotony. Inside Maplewood, the atmosphere grew heavier by the hour. Every glance was weighted, every silence charged. The air was no longer one of suspense alone but of dread, as though the house itself awaited confession. Poirot moved among the household with his usual composure, but those keen eyes missed nothing. He had a gift for knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, and silence, in his hands, was more formidable than accusation. By mid-afternoon, his silence had become unbearable. It was Miss Beatrice Armitage who broke first. She had been fluttering all morning, sketchbook clutched in hand, attempting to busy herself with foolish caricatures of Sir Rowland and Mrs. Redfern. Yet her hands shook so badly that the pencil left only jagged lines. At last, as Poirot passed her in the corridor, she gave a sharp cry and seized his arm. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she burst out, "I cannot endure it any longer. I must tell you, I must." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Then tell me, mademoiselle. But calmly, eh? Take a breath." Her words tumbled out in a rush. "It was not only the piano I heard that night. I said so before, but I concealed the rest. I heard voices, Monsieur Poirot, in the corridor outside my room. Low, urgent voices. A man and a woman. I could not hear the words, but the tone, angry, passionate. And then, a sob. I thought it was Eleanor." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And you did not say this before?" "Pourquoi?" She wrung her hands. Because I feared it would bring scandal. If Eleanor met someone in secret, what would people think? I thought it better to remain silent. But now, it feels like a weight pressing upon me." Poirot said softly, "And which way did the voices go, mademoiselle?" Her eyes darted. "Toward the east wing. Toward Eleanor's room." Poirot gave a small, precise nod. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have done well at last. But remember, truth concealed is like a note held too long. It sours." When Beatrice's revelation became known, it swept through the household like fire. Mrs. Redfern clutched her son's arm triumphantly. "There, you see, Arthur never left his room. It must have been one of the others." Sir Rowland harumphed, muttering about foolish girls and their sobbing. But Gerald's face turned curiously pale, and Marian's hand trembled where it rested upon her teacup. Poirot, who had resumed his place by the hearth, allowed the storm of reactions to spend itself before speaking. "So, a man and a woman in the corridor. The woman, we believe, perhaps, was Eleanor. The man, that is the question. Which of you, messrs, had the courage to meet her? Or the fear?" Gerald burst out angrily. "It was not I. I was with my wife the whole time. She will confirm it." Marian's lips parted, but the words came too slowly. "Yes, we were together." Her tone, though, lacked conviction, and Poirot's sharp glance did not miss the flicker of hesitation. Dr. Armitage cleared his throat. "I was in Lady Margaret's study until midnight. I could not have been in that corridor." Sir Rowland thumped his stick. "And I was in the library. Blast it all, anyone can vouch for me." Mrs. Redfern gave a sniff. "If you ask me, it was Gerald. Eleanor always made him uncomfortable. She knew something, I'm certain of it." Gerald wheeled on her. "Keep your tongue to yourself, madam, or I'll—" "Enough," Poirot interrupted sharply. His voice was still quiet, but the command in it silenced them all. He rose, small and neat, and gestured toward the piano in the corner. "You see, my friends, a melody may be simple, but when played by many instruments it becomes confused. Yet there is always a theme that repeats, hidden beneath the noise. We have heard now the theme of anger, of argument, of secrets. Who argues with Eleanor that night? Who makes her weep? That is the key." As he spoke, the door opened quietly and Lady Margaret entered, her face grave. She had overheard enough to understand. Her gaze swept the room, lingering on Gerald. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, in a voice low but firm, she said, "I too heard voices that night. I did not speak of it, for I wished to protect my family. But I can remain silent no longer. Eleanor quarreled with her brother." The words fell like stones in a still pond. Gerald sprang to his feet, his face flushed with fury. "It is a lie. I never—" But Marian's hand trembled violently upon the table, and her eyes, fixed on her husband, were full of despair. Poirot's gaze traveled slowly around the room. "Voilà," he said softly. "At last, a chord that rings true." The household of Maplewood passed that evening in a state of agitation bordering upon hysteria. Gerald Whitcomb's denials, Lady Margaret's solemn declaration, and Marian's tremor of despair had left every guest unmoored. Dinner was scarcely touched. Sir Rowland spilled his wine and cursed at his own clumsiness. Mrs. Redfern spoke in fierce whispers to her son. Miss Armitage fluttered her handkerchief until it resembled a white flag of surrender. Only Poirot appeared calm, seated at the head of the table with his small napkin folded to perfection. When coffee was served, he rose. His voice, though quiet, carried an unmistakable authority. Mess Amos, we have reached a point in our little drama where the time for concealment is past. Lies, they are like the false notes in a sonata. And tonight, I will play for you the music of truth. For that, I require all of you together. Lady Margaret, if you please, summon the household. We will assemble in the drawing room. There was a murmur of protest. Sir Rowland demanded to know what purpose this served. Mrs. Redfern insisted that her son should not be bullied further. But Poirot, with a small bow and a glint in his eye, silenced them all. The drawing room had been prepared with deliberation. Poirot had ordered the lamps lit, the curtains drawn, and the fire replenished. The piano stood open, its keys gleaming pale in the lamplight. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing it. When the company gathered, they found themselves seated as though upon a stage, with Poirot the conductor of their drama. He stood before them, small and immaculate, his hands clasped behind his back. So, we are complete. Each of you has spoken to me, yes? Each has told a story. But the stories, they do not agree. One says he heard nothing. Another, the piano. Another, voices. And always, the contradictions. What is the truth? That, we shall now discover. He gestured to the piano. On this instrument, Mademoiselle Eleanor played the melody which haunts this house. Some heard it, some did not. Curious, is it not? But music is not only sound, it is also memory. And the memory, Miss Amos, is treacherous. His eyes traveled from face to face, resting briefly on Gerald, then Marian, then Arthur. One among you quarreled with Eleanor that night. One made her weep. One lured her from her room into the storm. But which? Arthur, pale and trembling, burst out, "It was not I. I never left my room." Poirot raised a finger. "So you say, mon cher. Yet silence can be as guilty as action. You heard footsteps, did you not? You feared to speak. That is not crime, but it is cowardice." Arthur's head dropped, and Mrs. Redfern let out a hiss of indignation. Poirot moved on. "Dr. Armitage, you spoke of sedatives. Did you give Eleanor medicine that night?" The doctor hesitated, then said stiffly, "I prescribed, yes. But she did not come to me. I saw her only at dinner. After that, I was with Lady Margaret." "Exactment. And you, Sir Rowland, you claim you heard nothing. Always you hear nothing. Convenient, n'est-ce pas?" Sir Rowland blustered. "What's that supposed to mean? I'm half-deaf, man. Shell shock, years ago." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you hear only what suits you." Then his gaze fell on Gerald, and the atmosphere tightened. "And you, monsieur? You quarreled with your sister. Lady Margaret has told us so. What was the subject?" Gerald flushed, his jaw tightening. "A family matter. Irrelevant." "Rein du tout," Poirot said sharply. "There is no irrelevance when life is at stake. Did she reproach you with debts? With dishonor? With betrayal?" Marian let out a faint cry, as though struck. Gerald's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing. "Be silent, Marian." But the silence that followed was worse than speech. The others sat frozen, every nerve stretched taut. Poirot allowed the silence to grow, to lengthen until it became unbearable. Then he spoke again, softly, almost tenderly. "You see, Miss Amos, I have but to touch the string, and it vibrates. One among you cannot bear the sound of truth. Soon, the whole instrument will resonate. That is my trap. I play, and you, each of you, you will reveal yourselves." He gestured to the piano. "Eleanor left us an unfinished composition. She placed it upon her dressing table for all to see. It ends not with harmony but with discord. That is the key. She meant us to know her story was incomplete. Someone had promised to complete it for her. Who, I ask you, wished to silence her music? His eyes, sharp as glass, moved once more around the room. Marian had turned as white as her handkerchief. Gerald sat rigid, his fists clenched. Arthur buried his face in his hands. Mrs. Redfern stared with avid curiosity. Sir Rowland scowled. Dr. Armitage polished his spectacles furiously. Poirot folded his arms. I shall not press further tonight. But know this, the trap is set. And already, one of you has walked into it. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and the storm outside beat its tattoo upon the glass. Poirot's little eyes gleamed in the lamplight. He had drawn the bow across the strings of Maplewood, and the first discordant notes of confession were beginning to sound. The storm had abated by the following morning, leaving Maplewood bathed in a light that was at once clear and pitiless. The lawns gleamed wet, the orchard dripped with silver drops, and the air was sharp as glass. Within the drawing-room, the household assembled once more at Poirot's command. There was no protest this time. Each face bore the weary expression of one who knows resistance is futile. Poirot stood before them, immaculate as ever, his small frame radiating an authority disproportionate to its size. He held in his hand the sheet of music Eleanor had left upon her dressing table. Its unfinished bars trembled faintly as he lifted it. "Mess Amos," he began, "at last the melody is complete. We have lived these days in confusion, hearing fragments, discords, false notes. But now we must resolve the chord. Permit that I lay before you the truth." He turned first to Lady Margaret. "You, madam, heard the quarrel between your niece and her brother. You concealed it, par respect for the family name. Yet concealment cannot change what is true. Eleanor reproached Gerald, reproached him with his dishonor in business. She discovered, by accident, that funds entrusted to him were misused, that debts abroad threatened to engulf him. Is it not so, monsieur?" Gerald leapt to his feet, his face crimson. "It is a damned lie. I never—" "Sit, monsieur," Poirot said softly, and Gerald, with a strangled sound, obeyed. "You see, Eleanor knew. She threatened exposure, perhaps not to the police, but to Lady Margaret. And for you, a man of pride, that was intolerable. You went to her room that night." A gasp rippled through the company. Marian's hand flew to her mouth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "But you were not alone. Your wife followed. You thought Eleanor too weak, too timid. You believed she would not resist. Yet she did. She wept, she pleaded. The music she left unfinished was her cry, her protest, her warning. And then, Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. She vanished." Arthur made a choked sound. "But where is she? What happened to her?" Poirot raised a finger. "Patience, mon cher. Eleanor left the house by the terrace door. She did not go alone. The footprints show it. A man's and a woman's together. She went to the summer house. There was a struggle, not of blows, but of wills. The glove and the handkerchief, bah! They are planted to suggest violence. But the wax, that was truth. A candle, carried to hide the faces from those who might glimpse them through the windows. Eleanor did not return." Marian gave a low sob. Gerald's head turned toward her sharply. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Yes, madam. It is time. You will speak." With trembling hands, Marian rose. Her voice shook. "It was not meant to happen. I followed Gerald. I feared what he might do. They argued, yes. She accused him of theft, of disgrace. He swore her to silence. She refused. I begged them to stop. She rushed from the summer house into the orchard. Gerald, he tried to hold her back. She fell. She struck her head against the stone step. There was blood. Not much, but enough. She lay so still. Her voice broke. I wanted to fetch help, but Gerald dragged me away. He said it was too late. He swore that if it were known, it would ruin us all. We carried her to the boathouse by the stream and left her there. I begged him to tell the truth, but he would not. The room was utterly silent. Even Mrs. Redfern's sharp tongue was stilled. Poirot's voice, low but inexorable, filled the silence. Voila! The missing melody. Eleanor did not run away, nor was she murdered in rage by a hot-headed boy. She died by accident, an accident born of greed, of pride, of silence. Gerald sought to cover it with lies. Marian, torn by loyalty and despair, aided him. But the truth, it always plays its note, however softly. And Hercule Poirot, he hears it. Gerald sprang up, his fists clenched. You cannot prove this. It is her word against mine. Poirot's mustaches twitched. None, monsieur. There is proof. The fragment of wax, the smear of salt upon Eleanor's shawl, her tears. The unfinished composition. And the glove you planted, it bears your wife's perfume. A small touch, but fatal. The little gray cells, they see all. Marian collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. Gerald stood rigid, his face ashen. Lady Margaret rose, tall and unyielding, her eyes blazing. You have brought shame upon this house, Gerald. My husband's name, my father's trust, you have destroyed them. Eleanor is dead, and you have made her death a lie. Poirot inclined his head gravely. Justice, madam, must have its way. Sergeant Yarrow will take charge. The sergeant, pale and shaken, stepped forward. Gerald did not resist. The strength seemed to drain from him all at once. Marian sat motionless, her face buried in her hands. Poirot placed the sheet of music gently upon the piano. So, Amos, the melody is resolved. Not with harmony, but with tragedy. Yet even tragedy has its logic. Eleanor's voice was silenced, but her music, her music, spoke for her. It was enough. He smoothed his mustaches, his eyes bright and sorrowful. And now, my work here is done. The drawing room at Maplewood lay in silence long after Sergeant Yarrow had led Gerald away. The fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly. The air seemed to hang heavy with the words that had been spoken. No one moved. It was as though the house itself, long burdened with secrets, had at last exhaled its breath and fallen still. Lady Margaret stood erect beside the mantelpiece, her hands resting upon the carved stone. Her face was pale, but her bearing unbroken. Marian sat slumped in a chair, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Miss Beatrice wept softly behind her sketchbook. Sir Rowland muttered a prayer half under his breath, and Mrs. Redfern, for once, had nothing to say. Arthur sat motionless, staring at the carpet as though the patterns there might absolve him. Poirot remained by the piano, his small frame composed, his eyes reflective. At last he spoke. Miss Amos, you have seen the truth. It is not I who made it so. I am but the humble instrument. The truth, always it waits, silent, until someone has the courage to hear it. Mademoiselle Eleanor, she was silenced, yes, but her music spoke for her. She left us her cry upon the page, unfinished. It was for us to complete it. Lady Margaret turned, her voice low but firm. Monsieur Poirot, I thank you. Painful though it is, better the truth than a lie. Eleanor was dear to me. I will see that her rest is honored. Poirot inclined his head. You are strong, madam. Stronger than those who sought to conceal. Remember, honor lies not in silence but in facing what is. Gerald, he was not a wicked man by nature. But pride, it is a dangerous poison. It makes the weak cruel and the strong foolish. He wished to save his name, and in so doing, he lost it. Marian let out a low sob. Poirot's gaze softened as it fell upon her. And you, madam, you are guilty, yes, but more of weakness than of malice. You loved, you feared, you obeyed. For that, the law will judge with mercy, I think. But never forget, silence is complicity. To remain silent when truth must be spoken, say uncry Mossy. Mrs. Redfern stirred at that, her sharp features twisted with a grim satisfaction. Then perhaps my son may hold up his head again. Poirot's eyes glinted. Perhaps, madam. But do not be too proud. You saw his fear and thought it guilt. You accused him readily. Take care, for suspicion, it wounds like a blade. Arthur lifted his head at last, his voice breaking. She was kind to me, Monsieur Poirot. I admired her. I never. Poirot raised a hand. Non, mon petit. You need not protest. I know. She gave you kindness. You gave her loyalty. That is all. Let it be your comfort. Sir Roland growled something about damned tragedy, but his eyes were moist. Miss Beatrice dabbed hers openly, murmuring that she had always known Eleanor was too delicate for this world. Poirot did not correct her. Some illusions, he thought, were kinder left intact. He turned back toward the piano. The sheet of Eleanor's unfinished melody lay there still, the ink blotted where her hand had faltered. He touched it gently, as though it were fragile porcelain. You see, Immerse, life is like music. We begin with a theme, we wander through variations, we find dissonance. But always there must be resolution. Eleanor's melody was left unresolved, but it is not in vain. It has shown us the truth. And for Hercule Poirot, there is nothing greater than truth. He paused, smoothing his mustaches with a neat gesture. And now, I take my leave. The police will manage the rest. Justice will be done, imperfect, perhaps, for what justice can restore a life? But sufficient. He looked around the room one final time, his eyes lingering on each face. Learn from this, Immerse. Pride, secrecy, fear, they are the false notes. Play them too often, and the melody is ruined. But honesty, courage, these resolve the music into harmony. With that, he bowed. Adieu. Poirot took up his hat and cane, and with Hargreaves, solemn as ever, holding open the door, he passed from the drawing-room into the hall. The echo of his precise footsteps faded upon the stone floor, leaving the house to its silence, its shame, and its grief. Outside, the sun broke briefly through the clouds. The wet lawns glistened, and the orchard seemed to breathe again. The melody of Maplewood was finished at last, tragic, incomplete, but true.